Great seeing you here again. My name is Luc de Custer, founder of the Custer Academy, and we are looking further in the internal rate of return. How do we interpret the internal rate of return or the yield of the investment? How do we evaluate it, and what are the most important factors that we have to consider? But before we continue, don't forget to click on the subscribe button, click on the bell button, and every time we have a new video, YouTube will inform you about it. Let's have a look at the internal rate of return. In the previous video, I explained to you how to calculate the internal rate of return. And basically, it's the discount rate for which the NPV or the net present value is equal to 0. But what does it mean? Basically, we have the yield of the investment. And we have to compare the yield of our investment with the cost of capital. Companies use money. They have different ways to deal with money. They look at common shares, preferred shares, debts, and things like that. Basically, we have to evaluate how much do we pay for using money. When we look at the cost of money, we have to look at what we call the hurdle rate or the weighted average cost of capital. We have to understand how much interest, what percentage we have to pay on the money that we are using for our projects. So basically, we have to understand what the hurdle rate is about, or what is the weighted average cost of capital. When we look at projects, we have to be sure that the yield of our investment is higher than the hurdle rate. Otherwise, we don't have a good investment. Once we have calculated the internal rate of return for our project, for our investment, we have to find, or we have to see what is the hurdle rate of our company or the weighted average cost of capital. How do we find that? The hurdle rate or the WACC is basically defined on or based on three parameters. We have to look at the part done by the common shares, the preferred shares, and the debts. So basically, we have to find out what are the different percentages of all those elements, how much percent do they represent, and then you have to calculate the weighted average, hence the name weighted average cost of capital. The hurdle rate is very important because it provides us with a benchmark from which we can accept projects. When we look at the projects, we have to verify that the internal rate of return is at least equal to the hurdle rate or the WACC. Now, in some cases, we have to consider different elements. When we have the risk factor of a project, projects which are riskier have a higher percentage of failing. On the other hand, the reward may be higher. And what we have to do is to add a parameter for the risk, which is expressed as a percentage, an additional percentage, which we add to the WACC. And in that moment, we call it the required rate of return. That's the rate of return we at least want to realize when we have a project. Based on this, we can select projects, we can calculate the internal rate of return, and based on our calculation, we can see if our project complies with these conditions. If the IRR is lower than the hurdle rate or the required rate of return, we should not continue with the project. When the internal rate is higher, we have in fact a good chance that we have a good project and that the return of the project will be sufficient to compensate for the capital costs that we have. So that was it for this video, a quick overview how to evaluate the internal rate of return, how to compare it with the weighted average cost of capital or the required rate of return. That's it for now. Don't forget to click on the subscribe button, click on the bell button, and every time we have a new video, YouTube will inform you about it. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in our next video.